Nicodemus. He was a Pharisee, it says. He had some inklings about Christ, but was still scared, so he came at night, hiding himself. And he came to ask Christ, as a teacher, to tell him certain things. Christ gave him some very profound instructions. He says, for example, that unless you're born again with water and spirit, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Being a man, using worldly logic, he answers by saying, how can you be born again? You could go back into the mother's womb. But it's men all over, right? Notice the Samaritan woman didn't do that. Straight away, in her mind, there was a spiritual aspect, as I said to you last week during the feast we celebrated of the bird-bearing women, that the women have a different attitude, being more spiritual and able to grasp those things much easier and not being confused by it all. But Nicodemus gets very confused, starts applying worldly logic to it. Christ has to explain certain things to him. And he still continues to sort of half argue with the Lord about what he said. Christ says to him, if I told you earthly things and you believe not, how shall you believe if I tell you heavenly things, spiritual things? This is the tragedy of the fallen nature of males. They need explanation upon explanation upon explanation to get the point about spiritual things. He goes on then to tell Nicodemus about Moses and some of the incidences from the Old Testament, and that God sent forth his Son to give everlasting life. And the one who believeth in him is not judged, but the one who believeth not have already been judged. Everyone who practiseth bad things hateth the light and cometh not to the light, lest his work should be reproved. In any case, we know from the teachings of the Holy Fathers that Nicodemus left that missionary conversation somewhat confused. He didn't quite get the point. He did probably not fully believe or understand, even though later on he was one of the ones that tended to Christ's body and became a missionary worker himself, being a Pharisee, having given up that particular aspect of his life. But the difference here is profound compared to the Samaritan woman. She has no problems at all grasping the spiritual concepts of what the Lord is telling her about the living water, about the coming of Christ, that he was it, that he was the Christ. Nicodemus probably would have said, what do you mean? How can you prove all that? Why do you consider yourself the Christ? But this Samaritan woman had no such reply to that. In any case, I'm sure you can understand this, and you need to just go over that chapter, this third chapter in St. John, where you have this spiritual conversation with the male, Nicodemus, and then with the one we just read now, the spiritual conversation with the female Samaritan woman, and the difference between how they all accepted Christ's words and understood them. Therefore, in our own conversations, when we have a spiritual conversation, however it might be arise, you need to take account of that, who you are speaking to, and what sort of system you might need to use with a man or a male as opposed to women. Although today in the modern world, the spiritual aspect is pretty much blown out of every soul, and most people just degenerate into worldly, fallen logic, which does not give you life. Worldly fallen logic. The logic that dictates the world that is dying and going into death and decay. The spiritual logic, though, is different. It has aspects which we don't necessarily have, or we don't have much experience of it in our lives. We do have some, but the closer you draw to Christ's likeness through spiritual life, the more that becomes evident to you, and the more you will be able to carry a missionary conversation with another that can be fruitful. Which means, of course, you do need to study yourself and understand yourself and struggle by prayer and fasting and all those sorts of things that the patristic Holy Fathers have explained to us in how to live a spiritual life. Without that spiritual life, a missionary conversation is pretty much dead. If you just learn a few theological terms or something like precepts that are summarized somewhere, that's not going to be satisfactory to a person's soul. It's been proven over and over again. You've got to be able to somehow go deep and touch a person's heart by things that they can sense mystically. And everyone can, no matter who they are. One way or another, they can sense that mystically. The reactions then are going to be either they continually protest against you because they're so brainwashed about something, or they will want to know more. I hate to say it again, but whenever we do these conversations with Roman Catholics, usually the result is anger, derogatory, slander, and all sorts of things, because you have touched their soul in a way which contradicts everything that they've been taught. And they can't take that because it's been shoved into them for decades, the whole idea of the Pope and all the heresies that they believe in. And therefore, that's an aspect which you too have to be able to get across somehow, not falling into the same derogatory that they love to leash out at anybody, particularly Orthodox Christians, whom they consider departed from the church, which is rather absurd because when Rome departed in 1054, there were 5 jurisdictions, as I said to you, Rome being one of them. The other 4 have remained as part of the church to this day. Antioch, we just read now where that was the first time the word Christians was used. Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Constantinople, still part of the church. Plus, over the centuries, many other jurisdictions have been added as the world has been evangelized. So there we go. We have this lesson today about that which is part of your baptismal vows. Right? This is not something you do additionally. It's something that you've already given a promise to do, to be able to confess the truth before others if they ask you, or if the opportunity arises where you can do it without being asked in a good way. You're obligated to do that. Sad thing, of course, is that in our modern time, in the West in particular, those who should be doing that all the time and before the rest of the world don't do it anymore. Don't do it. They're scared like Nicodemus was. They hide behind the night and say nothing because they have already been given worldly gifts. In other words, they've sort of been captivated by that. And to go against that would mean them perhaps facing a jail term or something like that. Well, okay. If a bishop gets put in jail, how long is he going to be there? What a confession that would be before the others if somebody for the truth was jailed. Not for a crime, but for a truth. We know that there was much opportunity in that during that so-called lockdown and pandemic situation. But hardly anyone came forth. And those that did came forth were silenced. And nor was there homilies and talks promoted, but were somehow shoved into the background where it was very hard to find what they said. That's the main thing of this particular week that is given to us, the Samaritan woman. In Slavonic, her name is Svetlana, Fatina in Greek, which is someone who sort of shines with light. And she did do this, having so easily accepted the spiritual talk of the Lord and brought the whole village to believe in him. And then even after that, after the Pentecost feast, she also continued to do missionary work as one of the apostolic type figures, of whom there were many that arose at that time. God help us with all these sorts of things. In 2 weeks' time, or nearly 2 weeks' time, we will be celebrating the Ascension of the Lord, and then preparing ourselves for the descent of the Holy Spirit, the day of Pentecost, when the church is brought down from the heavenly realm, where it has been in the service of the angelic realm, and given to the earth as Christ's body. And that grows with those who add to that the belief of what that salvific reason is there for. God help you all. Christ is risen.
The truth is risen.